Thanks, Sally, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. So I wanted to talk about satellite data from the point of view of biodiversity net gain. And as many of you will probably be aware, the kind of increasing range of sensors, the ever-improving resolution, the frequency of data updates mean that satellites represent an enormous resource for observing planet Earth and understanding its environment. And there are a number of existing environmental applications that have already been found for satellite data. And so I want to talk about how satellite data might be applied to the world of biodiversity net gain. But we'll go on a little journey to kind of look at some of the other things that have satellite data have been used for already. So quickly about Digital Ecology, we're an organization that use digital technologies to help ecologists, environmental scientists, and others collect, manage, analyze, and share data, trying to sort of provide sort of digital solutions to workflow issues, data management issues, analytics, and reporting. And as Kieran said, I kind of have one foot in the camp of ecology and one foot over there in technology, and trying to bring those two worlds together so that almost acting like an interpreter between those two quite different sectors, and hoping that those digital technologies help environmental scientists, deliver better outcomes for the environment. But first, I wanted to kind of just explore some of the examples, applications of satellite data in ecology and environmental science, share some examples that I've found and enjoyed reading about, and then talk a bit more specifically about biodiversity net gain and the applications there, and then talk about, okay, well, where do we go from here, and what might we need to do collectively and collaboratively, hopefully, to make the best use of that data. So firstly, satellites are great. They point straight down at the Earth. They can get very high resolution imagery, and we can do lots of things with them. Here's an example of being able to count walrus from space. Walrus are facing the reality of climate change, they use both the land as part of their life cycle, and also go into the ocean, of course. And the retreat of sea ice means that actually sometimes they might need to swim further to find food or other places, and therefore expend more energy. So WWF, along with their partners, the British Antarctic Survey, are doing some work to try and count walrus numbers on these haul-outs, as they're called, to see what's happening to the population and how this, the sea ice issue is affecting them. And actually, you can take part in this. You can help WWF count walruses on satellite imagery to help them do the kind of first ever whole population census of walrus up in the Atlantic, better understand their populations, their distribution, and also what the impact of climate change is. So, a really great example of how satellites and people can come together to kind of help answer these questions. Another example is being able to count elephants from satellites in Africa. Elephants are, large animals, so hopefully relatively easy to spot, but also they tend to move around quite a lot, and they can be in very forested areas as well as out on the open. And it's much harder to count them when they're underneath the trees than it is in the middle of the plains. But some work from Bath University, along with Oxford and Twente in the Netherlands, used higher resolution imagery to capture elephants moving through forests and grasslands. And the population of these elephants has declined quite significantly over the last century. There's African elephants now classified as being endangered. So using satellite data helps eliminate the risk of disturbing those animals that might happen if you're on the ground. It also means that you're not putting humans and elephants into conflict. And it also hopefully makes it easier to count the movement of animals between countries across borders where there might be other issues, human issues, that mean that might be quite hard. So yeah, another example of how satellites can be used for species monitoring. Of course, it goes beyond that. We'll have all read about the fires across various parts of the world over the last summer, the hottest summer on record so far, and enormous areas of land destroyed by fire. And satellites are very useful for tracking those fires, understanding where they are, where they've been, the area of land that's been damaged, what might be in danger. So both from a biodiversity or sort of wildlife nature conservation management, but also from a sort of health and safety point of view, being able to track these things in almost real time is really, really helpful, and helps us understand the extent of the damage, and sort of tries to do assessments on things like, carbon loss and habitat loss and those sorts of things. And finally, the final example is here from Brazil, NASA's satellite monitoring of rainforest loss. This kind of image shows, the areas of rainforest lost over various years. And the Brazilian government set up an early data collection system for forest loss using satellite observation to calculate how much was being lost each year. And later systems have been able to make use of higher resolution imagery, more regular observations, such that the difference between when it first set up to now is before it used to take a couple of weeks to send information to rangers in the field. Now it takes a day to send alerts to say, look, forest loss is happening here. So that just goes to show that the frequency of data collection, the resolution of the imagery, is really important for understanding the rapid changes that are happening into our environment across the planet, and being able to respond to and understand those as best we can, without necessarily having to deploy lots and lots of people onto the ground to collect the same sorts of information. So what about biodiversity net gain? Where do I think satellite data fits in with that? And I think there are three key areas to that: habitat mapping, habitat condition, and monitoring. And so this is very much a personal point of view, and you may have additional things where you think this can be applied, and fascinated to hear your thoughts in the discussion later. But for me, and the work that I've been doing, this is where I think we really have that opportunity. The key thing here is that, from my point of view as an ecologist, satellite data is not a replacement for professional or qualified experienced ecologists. When it comes to biodiversity net gain and development, the level of detail required for an application stage of a development project, a development planning application, can't be replaced by satellite imagery. We need people to go out into the field and collect information based on surveys. However, if we're at feasibility or optioneering stage, project scoping, those kind of early stage assessments, good quality satellite data and analytics can provide us with some valuable information that helps us to inform decision making and can be used to focus efforts on the ground later on. So there's also, I think, enormous value in using satellite data for monitoring delivery of biodiversity gain, both what's being delivered on sites and what's being delivered off sites. So here's how I think that fits together, and I apologise for not sort of going into the detail of biodiversity net gain about it, but hopefully that will sort of become clear as we go through. So habitat mapping. There's already a number of satellite-derived habitat maps available, many of which are available as open data, and here's 4 examples of those on the screen for you. The problem with, as you can probably see from looking at these, there's a lack of consistency or standardization between those different products. Coverage and resolution varies enormously, and accuracy also varies enormously. And so while these types of data sets are great if we want to look at landscapes or regions or indeed entire countries, when it comes to individual development sites, some of which are very small, this type of mapping may not be as useful, particularly the open data, when it comes to that application stage. And you can see, looking at these, that there's variations in the coverage, there's variations in the resolution. We've got different classification schemes. It means that one one data set will call one thing pasture, another will call it grassland, and a third or fourth yet something else. So being able to compare these data sets together and sort of bring them together to understand things in detail is hard, because you're not always talking about the same things. But we can combine these data with other sources of data, such as the priority habitat data, protected sites, any other data you might be able to get your hands on to help us at those early stages of projects, probably generally large scale projects, to say, okay, where do we think the key or the best habitats are in our project area, and what can we do in terms of engaging with the mitigation hierarchy and avoiding impacts on those best parts. What the satellites can't tell you, of course, is what the species composition or the relative abundance of plants in each of those habitats are. And those data are absolutely crucial for determining habitat types, particularly in the UK HAB system. And therefore, you need to go out on site and do a survey. But this data perhaps helps you prepare for the types of survey you might need to do, and then you send out your surveyor or your botanist to go and do those surveys. These data are getting better all the time, and at that early project stage, or for those landscape or regional analysis, where the precision of that habitat identification isn't important, these sorts of maps are absolutely essential, but perhaps not appropriate to that detailed planning application stage. The second area, I think, is around habitat condition, and we're going to hear from my colleague Richard shortly about some work that he's been doing on habitat condition. But as a bit of a trailer, here's some examples of some work that he and I have been doing this year. So here's a site that I visited in South Gloucestershire, which has some grassland and some woodland, a pond, one or two other bits and bobs. So I carried out a habitat survey and a condition assessment for the site. Richard and his team took that data and compared it to their satellite imagery to see if they could then also determine condition. So you can see on the top right-hand side there, my condition assessment. So the darker green is a good condition habitat, the lighter green is a moderate condition habitat, and below it, the same information provided back from the satellites. So we can start to see that actually there's a reasonably good correspondence between what I'm seeing on the ground and what the satellite can tell. And of course, that's improving all the time, and Richard will talk about this in a lot more detail. Again, when I go out onto site, and when ecologists go out onto site, you collect lots of information that helps you describe the habitat and its condition, to be able to assess condition using the criteria provided by DEFRA, things like percentage cover of scrub, or the amount of bare ground, or the age structure of the woodland, or any of the other criteria that there are for habitat condition. Obviously, a satellite can't do that, but it can help us use some information to get a good idea of what the condition of that habitat might be, and then later on we can go and confirm that on the ground. So again, for desk studies, for feasibility, optioneering, those types of early stage projects, we can use this condition data to help us create a more accurate picture of the baseline and therefore the potential impacts of the development. So rather than defaulting everything to moderate condition because we just don't know, the data that we can get from satellites help us to better capture actual condition and actual variation, and therefore the kind of number of units that habitats might generate in terms of the DEFRA metric. And one of the most important things about Biodiversity Net Gain is that it embeds within it the mitigation hierarchy. So we want to avoid losses of biodiversity first before we do anything else. And I think if we've got better data on habitats and their condition at the early stage, that can help us avoid losses of the best habitats and achieve better designs for biodiversity net gain. And the earlier we do that, the better those outcomes for biodiversity are likely to be. So finally, monitoring. Monitoring, I think, is going to be one of the biggest challenges around biodiversity net gain. All of the designs for schemes that get submitted with planning applications and all of the sites on the Natural England DEFRA register will require monitoring. And that's true both for biodiversity that's delivered on site and those things that are delivered off site. And it's expected that quite a large proportion of the net gain delivery will probably be on site, on development sites, and how those habitats are going to be monitored is as yet unclear. And we're hoping that later this month to hear more detail about how the whole thing is going to work. But certainly for on-site, it seems that job will largely fall to the already overstretched local planning authorities and their officers. So how is that monitoring going to be done? Maybe satellites can help in that process. And so the frequency at which imagery is collected, combined with the ability to identify both habitat type and habitat condition, means that those data can be used as sort of an early warning system for where things may be going wrong. So in this example, we've got an area of land, and I've circled or mapped out 5 different woodland polygons, and we can see from that color scale that there is huge variation in the condition of those different woodlands, and we can see which ones may be performing really well and which ones maybe aren't performing so well. And that may be because it's early on in the process and we're yet to see the impact of management, or it may be that the management that should be carrying out isn't having the impact we expected, or it could be indeed that no management is taking place where it should be. So this helps us to be able to focus efforts on those sites and those habitats, both where we have the greatest potential risk in delivery, and also where the sort of greatest value could be derived from those habitats, and allowing us to kind of sort of set up little warnings and alerts to say, actually, there's something not quite right here. This is where we should deploy our on-the-ground resource to go and see what's going on. So combine satellite data with reporting from ecologists, and you can take a risk-based approach to monitoring those habitats that, as I said, either of the greatest importance, the greatest risk, or the greatest value, and targeting those sites that seem to be struggling to meet the targets and intervening early to make sure they're successful. So the frequency and the kind of the resolution of these satellite data help us to set up those systems to allow us to see what's happening across the different sites that may be in a local planning authority area, and provide us with a way of targeting our ground-based efforts towards those places where it is most needed. And that may be ecological survey work to confirm what's going on, but it also may be advice and guidance for landowners, land managers, and deliverers to say, I can see that you're struggling here. Let's explore why that might be and what we can do to improve the outcomes for those habitats. I think what is always important is working together to try and improve the quality and interoperability of data generally, and that's certainly true for satellite data. And I think there's 2 things that would make these Myriad data sets work better across the board for everybody. And the first one is the standard spatial framework. If everyone's using the same spatial framework, then actually what we're looking at is the quality of the data and the sort of interpretation and all the other things that go on behind that, rather than which parcel of land we're looking at. And that helps with verification and validation, so we can tell the good from the bad from the indifferent. So that's number 1. Number 2 is all using the same habitat classification system, and that makes it easy to make sure we're all talking about the same habitats, and again data can be paired, so we're not going, is this pasture or grassland or rough grassland or anything else. We know we're talking about the same things when we're looking at it, and that would really help. There is a move towards using one system within Biodiversity Net Gain, but it's not wholly adopted. So, some work around that with the satellite data would help as well. I'm sure there are other things, but for me, those are the 2 biggest things. Neither of them are easy to achieve. And at the moment, each uses different standards or different systems. But if we can kind of agree, or at least work towards agreeing on these standardized approaches, then that will make the power of that data so much greater and its application to these projects better. So in summary, satellite data are not an end-to-end solution for ecologists. We still need boots on the ground and survey work and botanical skills and all the rest of it. However, if you combine them with other data, with ecological expertise, with information that comes back from those field surveys, they do add value to our ecological assessments, and I think can be incredibly useful at the early stage of project development in terms of identifying the issues and opportunities when it comes to development projects. And so I think satellite data are useful early in projects to help with those things at scale, particularly to support landscape or regional planning, and in addressing the mitigation hierarchy, i.e. what should we be avoiding, where is the best habitat, how does that influence site allocations or infrastructure planning, and also for monitoring change over time, to support delivery both on site and off site when it comes to biodiversity net gain. They're not a substitute for professional, qualified, experienced ecologists and can't provide the detail required at the application stage, but they certainly can add value to the work that ecologists do. And that is the end of my presentation.